Good morning, everybody. It is
Hello.
June 8th, 2020, and we're on episode 46, where we continue our conversation about police abolition.
Right.
Maybe to introduce ourselves, I'm Mark Van Stunik. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
Daniel Wolpert, I direct MICA at the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. Good morning, everybody. Hey, Kathleen. We continue to have this wild couple of weeks here in Minneapolis, and of course, it's spread all over the world. Even the Norwegians were fired up yesterday.
Ooh.
Something like 12 to 15,000 Norwegians were marching for racial equality. So that was, pretty wild. And so we had a really big day here in town.
Yes.
And it was pretty heady stuff. The super majority of the Minneapolis City Council is made all these public statements about very radical change in policing. And, for those of us that have been wanting this to happen for decades, it was super cool. And, we need to give all the organizers, all the folks that have been involved in this, all the marchers, just a ton of credit, because the pressure has been on and the politicians are running scared.
Yeah, and so yesterday, we knew these announcements were coming, but so we had a majority of the city council gather at Powderhorn Park. And it's hard to tell how many thousands of people were there, but there were a lot of people there sitting in the hot sun in these COVID times, listening to them all promise, hey, we're going to dismantle the police without, and maybe it's too early to really expect specifics, but there's always that fear that comes across your mind when a politician makes a general promise instead of a specific one. So before we started, we were talking about like, what can we realistically expect? What is this? Where is this all leading? And the answer is like, who really knows? Like, we don't know. Yeah. There's so many pieces at play. And I think that's kind of what we want to dig into is like, what's all going on underneath the surface? What can we realistically expect? How do we even know what to expect? Where's this headed for other cities? And already some of you are commenting about hopes for this to spread and what you're noticing elsewhere. So maybe we should dive into those and then dive back out.
Let's throw those up there.
Donna writes, probably like Los Angeles' new proposal or the other handful of cities that have refocused how citizen calls are responded to and reallocated funding to make it so. I've been living in the Minneapolis bubble with all this happening, so I don't know. I know that.
Right. So in Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti has promised to reallocate $250 million, 150 of that coming from the police budget into different community services and things. Now, it's a huge chunk of change. It's a pretty tiny percentage of the LA police budget. We actually mentioned this on Friday. It's about 4.5%. But it's a big chunk of change, and certainly is not something that ever would have been considered a couple of weeks ago. There's a lot of great stuff coming out. I've posted some things on my Facebook page. A lot of other people are posting it, comparisons about police budgets in cities relative to budgets for other things.
Yes.
It's pretty terrifying, when you actually dig into these numbers.
It's worse than the federal budget's relationship with the military. Like,
yes,
if we think we have a bloated military budget compared to what we spend on other things in this country, the police departments are worse. They're a bigger chunk.
Yeah.
At least from the stuff I've been seeing. Yeah. And so this relates to somebody that's going to jump down to this because I think it ties in with that previous comment. I appreciate this conversation. I have been very confused about what it means to defund the police. A lot of people on the news are saying, don't worry, we're just talking about reform. And to me, that's the crux.
Yes.
What does it mean? I think different people are meaning different things when they say defund the police, and
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think that the thrust of it goes in two, to me, I think two different directions. And again, the MPD 150 folks, but there are some other groups. A friend of mine posted a similar project that's happened in Durham, North Carolina. So I think there's uh, two directions that this goes in. One is sort of what we might call an ideological or fundamental underlying assumption direction. And then another is the direction of practical, where's the money go to, right? So the one is this ideological piece that looks at police and says, look, the history of police is in these slave patrols, union busting, all these organizations that are either racist, very capitalist, supporting the property owners, the white folks, and that's kind of baked into their DNA. And so, yeah, so they are going to prioritize stopping, people who are black when they're driving, right? And we know all the statistics. You're like 10 times more likely to be stopped driving while black than driving while white, and that's just this reflexive thing that happens. And so, part of the abolition is we need to create organizations that are separate from that DNA thread. Like
yeah,
we need to create a new DNA thread. And then the other part of it is then the very practical part of, there's something wrong with the fact that hospital workers don't have PPE, but cops, have all this equipment to make them look like Captain America. Like there's a funding disparity, and where do we want funding to go? So I think those are the two kind of threads to this argument. And but then, right, the devil's always in the details. How is that going to play out?
yeah. And with that first group, that's more ideological, there's this recognition that there's this whole. I like throwing out the term that it's not my term, the carceral system, like that. There, everything from the prison to the policing to the legal system is all created in a very punitive way. And so when you tell people go look for problems to punish, there's going to be certain outcomes. And one of the more hopeful things that I did hear from the city council was we need to shift towards a public health model, which is where do people need support, and how do we preemptively get at what's causing things that spill over into what we consider crime. And to me that's kind of at the core of the philosophical shift of what defunding the police is like, okay, if all we're doing is figuring out we're going to spend money once things hit the crisis point, then we're doing it wrong. We need to preemptively solve some of these problems and then look at it in a public health way. And I think that's going to be where a lot of backlash is, because we've already had this conversation with gun reform about public health model.
Except we've already seen a perfect example of this. So if we look at the way that crack was dealt with and the way that opioids was dealt with, we see the exact example of what we're talking about here. So crack was a drug that was largely being disseminated throughout black communities, and that was addressed from a crime point of view. And you had throwing people in jail, you had tanks busting down people's doors. It was all about crime and punishment. Right? The opioid crisis, suddenly it's a bunch of white kids in the suburbs, stealing their parents' Oxy. And oh my gosh, lo and behold, we can approach this from a public health point of view. And we can talk about prevention strategies, and we can talk about clinics, and we can talk about pain management, right? And suddenly we're not throwing all these, there are no tanks in the suburbs knocking down rich people's doors, arresting people for doing heroin. And so we can look at an example that has already happened in our society and see how that could play out across every issue, issues of violence, issues of poverty, housing issues, property issues. All of those things could be addressed from a health and caring point of view.
Kathleen, this is another thing I've been hearing. Kathleen writes, racism is so deep in our society. If we shift to a public health model, won't racism still be an issue? Well, yeah.
Well, absolutely. But for example, one of the things that people have been talking about is to actually name racism as a public health problem, right? So rather than say, oh, we're going to deal with like violence as a public health problem or poverty as a public health problem, but then racism is still kind of lurking in there, right? And affecting everything. We actually say, no, racism is a public health problem. And so now that's in the spotlight and we're dealing with that very directly.
I mean, this is still, all the crappy things about our society will still be existing in some ways. And if we make the shift, but the difference is like, we have to ask, how are we going about diagnosing the problem and who has the power in that process? And so this is part of the conversation that's been happening, is just the idea of having the police somehow vaguely accountable in name only to communities of color, which is what we've tried to do in the last, since Minneapolis has tried to reform things. But structurally, that they haven't had any power. So the question is, how do you structurally change power so that the community has more of a say in how we structure things, how we allocate funds, how we diagnose things? And that's just a long uphill battle. But that conversation seems to be starting, and it's up to us to keep putting pressure on our city councils to keep that conversation moving.
Right.
But Anthony writes, if anybody can dig this up and share this, that'd be great. Where's a link to the comparison of police budgets and city budgets?
Yeah. So again, Anthony, if you just jump on my Facebook page, everything is public. The post that's at the top is one graphic that I believe it's Cleveland, maybe Cincinnati comparison.
Well, that was Columbus, maybe, but
is it Columbus? One of those Ohio
They're all the same.
And then you scroll down a little bit, and there's a great article from The Atlantic that looks at this in much greater detail, and also compares it to other countries. And when you compare it to other countries, it's even more terrifying, right? Because, my favorite line out of that article is that the number of people killed by police in England, Scotland, and Wales in the last 24 years is the same as was killed in the first 24 days in America in 2015. So you let that sink in for a little bit. Yeah, and so one of the things about our dear city council, which, they're seeing the light, right, is we need to be very realistic and honest. This is not a city council that has been in favor of any kind of radical police reform. They just approved a budget in the fall that had an increase in funding for police, same group of people. They have been totally resistant to most of the requests for reforms. They have been completely unwilling to put various issues on the ballot. There was a request for a reformist public referendum on the police. They blocked that going on the ballot. So, while this council was touted as this great progressive council, they have not acted that way in regards to policing. And it was only with this incredible uprising that they frankly have been forced, and it's very now politically expedient for them to say these things, right? And they get big cheers, everybody's cheering, yay! But for my money, we cannot just turn around and go home and go, they're going to take care of it. That's going to be great. I don't trust them to do that because they haven't shown any reason to trust them in this regard.
Kathleen writes, our police department in Kansas City gets military equipment, but they don't get to keep it unless they use it.
Yeah.
That's gross. I don't have any better response besides how disgusting that is.
Right. And so, for example, I mean, that's been one of the calls in some of these, abolition or radical restructuring movement is, we want these police departments to return all of this military hardware, right? And this was actually a move that was begun with Obama. I mean, this is not a Trump thing. After the Iraq wars, they had all this junk left. And they're like, great, let's requisition it to police departments. And so police departments have, Humvees and these armored vehicles and, rocket launchers and all this crap that is military hardware, and they should return it to the federal government or melt it down or something.
Give it to street artists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a great comment from Ceres. The police abolition thing is making me revisit My Grandmother's Hands. Great book, folks. Yeah. Check it out. Once more on racialized trauma and how baked in it is in our culture and our systems and our bodies. I mean, so this isn't just fanciful leftist talk. I mean, I know it's hard to think about systems. So we don't have the systems we have aren't created from scratch right now. They have the weight of history and we build upon that. And so so biases aren't just, this is one of the hardest things for some people to get. A bias isn't just baked into an individual. So you can replace all the police officers with people of color and this stuff will still happen. Because if you tell people, go after where you think the biggest crime is and focus in on it. And remember who's paying for this. And you're going to have people do the same kinds of activities based upon the weight of the established systems. You can get training. The guy who murdered George Floyd was a trainer. He helped train the other police officers how to respond in a humane fashion. So it's not training, getting different people in there, hiring a black chief of police, which we have now, getting a reformist mayor, body cameras, good reporting. We have all that.
Right. And nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed.
Yeah. And I saw a great quote this morning along these lines about how, the fact that we as Americans have such a hard time in visualizing a nonviolent community way of caring proves how we have just been brainwashed into this violent system, right? We've been totally brainwashed to believe that violence is the only answer to public safety. And so that's, again, an example of what Ceres is talking about, right? This is so deep, that when you say to people, wow, can you imagine a system where, your cops don't have guns? And people are just like, no, that's impossible, right? That is a frame of reference, and that is a worldview that we have learned by watching, cops and robber shows and the Wild West movies and all that kind of stuff. And so, so it's hard for us to have the prophetic imagination to see otherwise.
Betsy asks, are there models of success? We have wanted police to be social workers for a long time.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, so again, what's interesting about this Atlantic article, which has these international comparisons, is that you see that there are many other countries that spend way less money on policing, that certainly have way less police violence. And concomitantly, what they do is they spend way more money on social systems. They spend way more money on systems of care. And again, this gets down to what do human beings want, right? And, we have to either think that Americans are uniquely psychopathic and crime-ridden and violent versus everybody else in the world, or we have to posit that, no, the way that we're just going about doing all this stuff is wrong. And what people want is they want decent, safe livelihoods. And if you don't have that, then yeah, people are going to behave in all kinds of bad ways. And if you then respond to that behavior with more violence and oppression, then they're going to react even more negatively. And so the models of success are to say, let's help people live better, safe, healthier lives, and then there'll be less crime. And it's actually true. It works.
Yeah, and then the other piece of it is, and I'm going to jump to this comment. Actually, hey comrades, I live on Lesvos, Greece for a few years. The police kept the locals from violent acts against the huge refugee population there. What alternatives do you propose? We don't have a list of a bunch of proposals. This is part of what we're trying to think about, is like, what does it look like? And this is the work that's ahead of us. But there are some basic things.
Well, yeah, and there actually are lots of lists. I mean, we actually do have.
We don't have like this. We don't have a 10-point plan that has been agreed upon that's sitting right in front of us. Right now, it's the work of figuring out what's our game plan. But if you go to like MPD 150, Reclaim the Block has some, and there's different groups out there with proposals, and a lot of them look like this. So if you do a wellness check on someone right now, you call the police, and someone with a gun goes into a situation to check on whether or not your grandmother is okay. Or if someone with a mental health issue is okay. That's a recipe for disaster, which we've seen time and again. So we need to break up these pieces that anything that you shouldn't really have a military personnel sent in to use lethal force, you should break that into a different group and then start looking at why do we have this group of armed violent enforcers and figure out like how can we preemptively resolve the problem that we think that they're solving. And so this is basically the approach. And there's little bits and pieces of this tried out in different places. And so it's about gaining that wisdom and coming up with a whole new model that, as Dan was saying, is more focused on health and prevention of these issues from getting to the point of being a crisis point. When it comes to violent acts against the refugee population, I mean, that's an interesting one. Like, what do you have when there's a group of violent people causing harm to another group of people? That's to me where it gets more to that's the point where you think you want to have a disciplined, trained group of violence users to keep a greater violence from happening. And I think almost every police abolitionist will recognize there needs to be self-defense that isn't just left up to the general population to figure for themselves, but that shouldn't look like a fully funded large police department, which is what we have now.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. So Kathleen's got this great statement that really hits on the racist piece.
This movement is very scary to some of the white culture. One of my parishioners is worried about her granddaughter because, in her words, she is very blonde.
So right. And, yeah. Well, yeah. And, this is the thing. I mean, white people want their police because they are scared of Black people and people of color. And I think we need to name that, and again, this is the racism thing. Like, if we name the racism and we say the racism is a problem and a public health issue, we can start dealing with it. But we have, and day after day, and there was another one today, and this was absolutely hilarious. This is like, old people that can't use their cell phones. This retired Navy guy and his wife somehow managed to put their phone on Facebook Live and streamed half an hour of their racist rants. And, somebody got it and kept it. And, now they're in a shit ton of trouble. And of course, what are they saying? We're not racist.
What we said in that casual half hour doesn't reflect their deepest values.
That's right. And then their organization that this guy's getting fired from, some Navy alumni organization, of course, they come out and they say, we're not racist. It's like, guys, it's bullshit. Like, fess up. Just confess and repent. It would be a lot easier than being embarrassed on CNN because you can't use your cell phone. But yeah, I mean, that's got to be a big, huge part of this change, because if the underlying motivation continues to be, I need cops to protect me from the big, scary Black guy, then that is going to continue to be an obstacle for reform, for sure.
It's also a reality that most of policing isn't responding to violent threats. So we use these. We always come down.
Right.
Like, what about the murderers and the rapists? I'm like, one, that's not most of where the policing energy goes to.
Right.
I've heard time and time again, when it comes to rape, the police only complicate and make things worse. They're not really part of a solution, and they always respond after the fact. So there's not something that the police do that's really helping that situation. And when it comes to murder, again, like I can't remember. Maybe vaguely, sometimes it happens. Some violent murderer is about to kill someone, and the police jump in and kill him before it gets a chance. These are like that happens in television all the time, but it rarely ever happens in the real world. So we have the way we respond to those folks after they've done a murder would probably still be kind of the same. Like, so I don't understand.
And again, so we need to, right, and what Mark is saying here is so important. We need to be reality based and not jump into our fears and fantasies, right? So the Ferguson Police Department, where does a third of their budget? I mean, this is unfathomable. A third of their budget comes from nuisance traffic stops of Black people. Okay, so right there, like, you could reduce the police budget by a third of just saying, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay, and believe me, that's far more police activity, as Mark's saying, than running around jumping on top of potential murderers and preventing them from murdering people, which probably just never happens.
And having hopped up dudes with guns wandering around like giving out nuisance tickets and always being ready for a threat is a recipe for disaster. If anybody who's been in a locker room with a bunch of jocks understands that mentality. So, but the other piece of it, like, so I've only spent time in a jail for half a day. So like half a day I was in a jail, and everyone there was, except for one guy. So everyone was there for either sleeping where they shouldn't be sleeping because they're experiencing homelessness, or they were there for like a drug charge where the bail was set at $50. And a lot of them would have to miss work. They didn't have $50 on them, so they had to rely on somebody else to come for $50 with a pot, like having a couple joints in their pocket, right? The two exceptions were me, who I was there because I wiped fake blood on a federal courthouse. So I knew I was the only one who was really probably should have been there. This other guy who was from the suburbs who was there for a DUI charge, and he was just crying that he was experiencing injustice. And I can get the sense that guy doesn't happen very much. So like everyone there besides two people had really absolutely no reason to be there even whatsoever. Right. That's how it is most of the time. And so it ties in with how many people are in jail because of drug shit. A lot. And so this police abolition ties into prison abolition. Most of what we think, the scare scenarios are a small percentage of overall where the bandwidth comes.
Tiny.
Yeah.
David's got.
Yeah, our inability to imagine a nonviolent system of community care is proof that we have been brainwashed.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. Getting a shout out for your second edition of your book. Good. For
which one?
So also just bought the second edition of the Unkingdom. Good stuff.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Anyways, it didn't show up for me for some reason. So John's writing, I'm following this development closely and eager to see what they do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of comments like that, and I've seen around. And to me, this is the exciting and scary time. Is Minneapolis is now setting a tone that I think other cities will look to, and so we have to be. This is not a time to like start peeing into our lemonade with criticisms. I think we need support to try to figure out how can we create something that other people can take and run with. And now is not a time to be afraid and reformist, but to like be bold and come up with a vision that really takes feedback from people who are most crushed by police violence. It's exciting if we can actually move this forward.
David's comment about the Minnetonka Police Department is great.
Our Minnetonka Police Department said the calls they've received the past 2 weeks are white people calling in suspicious behavior, which was, quote, there is a Black person in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
And of course, if you're not aware of the whole list of, doing things while Black that you get called the cops on you for, you should Google that. I mean, the list is pretty amazing. And again, these are examples of activities and police behaviors that if all of that sort of stuff was eliminated, your police budget would be down to probably 10 or 20% of what it is now, and you would not notice any change in society. And this is the thing I think, particularly that white people need to wrap their head around, is that we've created this monster that really does not need to exist for societies and communities to be safe and healthy and good. Serious as an example.
I've had to file a police report 3 years for being punched in the face in my car, but I had to put robbery instead of assault because I could not identify the puncher. The filing process was just as traumatizing as the assault. And that's what I've heard time and again from people who have actually been in a place where they go to the police to get help, but the police really isn't into investigating and helping. It's again, the revenue comes from all these, like, it's all about these drug charges, and like, it's basically like performance theater to show their presence around, to show how necessary they are, and respond to some things, but not doing it effectively in any way that brings healing and help to our neighborhoods.
So again, we're at the end of our time, but thanks for all the great comments. And, I think the two asks that I would have for people are, one, educate yourself about this stuff. There is tons of great information out there. And so actually take the time to do that. And I know it's a little time and a little work, but do that. And two, we need to keep the pressure up on these politicians, and we need to be healthily suspect. And really insist that we start to get some specific actionable changes.
And also, just to add, next year is a mayoral election in Minneapolis, and Mayor Fry has basically said, I'm not supporting all this stuff that the city council is throwing down, and so maybe he should be replaced. So if somebody's listening, you think, I know someone who'd be a great mayor for Minneapolis, now's the time to encourage them.
All right. We'll see you all tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.